Yeah, hey everybody, thanks for coming to listen to me talk about Drupal entities and getting data out of them. I'm Patrick Coffey. You can find me on the internet at patrico.coffeo, and I work for 4 Kitchens and write lots of code for them. So let's get started. Drupal is awesome. We're all here at a Drupal event talking about Drupal and doing Drupal things and being really cool, right? And Drupal is really good at letting you create content types and create really structured data and manage that structured data. And it's very good at letting you create websites, basically. It also has really good tools for working with that data and rendering it and letting you put it into a panel pane and putting it into views, and there's a whole templating system around taking entities and rendering them and looking at them, right? And it works really well. That's not really a problem at all. The problem that you run into with Drupal is when you try to get data outside of it, right? It's almost sort of a troll, right? Because there's so much data and entities that you don't need, and it's just like where to start. Like you can take an entity and sort of like write a bunch of PHP around in conditionals and say like, if this works, then like concatenate it here and do this and that, and then you just end up with this mess, right? And it just gets really complicated. So properly extracting and formatting data from Drupal entity objects really gets to be verbose and complicated, and it's really frustrating. And organizing and making your extraction and formatting rules modular so that you can reuse them all across your code base is really tough, really difficult, because you'll end up with like functions that turn a date into a date string that's formatted right, and you'll like use the date format string from Drupal, and that does this thing with this other function, and then you have all this like linear PHP functions that work together kind of, and it just becomes this maintenance nightmare, and it's really bad. So if you're dealing with a lot of entity types, this problem is really exaggerated. You're trying to extract and format data from like nodes, from taxonomy terms, from users, from custom entities that you've built, and then you have a bunch of different field types that you're trying to get data from, right? So you have like date fields, author fields, you have email address fields, text fields, integer fields, and then you have versions of those fields that have multiple cardinality, right? And then multiple languages of those fields, right? And it just gets to be really complicated. And if you try to actually write code to get this data out of these fields, you'll end up with a mess. An example situation of this that I ran into was the client of 4 Kitchens had a really specific set of formatting rules for their data. And actually, we weren't even taking the Drupal and getting it outside the data and getting it outside of Drupal. We were just trying to create component-based like templates for different parts of the website. And what we needed to do is we needed to have those templates just have like very properties that weren't specific to entity types, right? They were just properties that you could pass an object of data into and render, because we wanted to use the templates for multiple entities of multiple types, right? And there were very specific formatting rules, very big rules around like lots and lots of entity types and lots of fields, hundreds and hundreds of fields. And so their formatting rules had to be field type agnostic, right? So let's say that you had a string field that you needed to turn into some sort of like concatenated snippet of that thing. You could go and you could take a function from Drupal, run it through that, it would do its thing, and you'd have like an ellipses at the end of it, right? But let's say that you needed to do that on like 3 different types of field. Let's say like a body field, a text field, and then like some other field on a field collection, right? That could get really complicated. And then you would have different fields with different, that are just actually different fields that are of the same type that have to be processed the same way. Or processed the same way except these 3 rules, right? And so you just have all these deviations from like the parent rule set, and it was just a mess. And the code base became really big. We tried to just do this as you might do it normally on a PHP site, and we weren't allowed to use certain tools that we should have been allowed to use, honestly. Like panels, out of the question. We're not allowed to use them. It was just like enterprise level rules, right? And so we had to solve this problem. code base was becoming ridiculous. We had multiple people working on this mechanism that was supposed to get data out of Drupal entities and render it correctly, right? And the code was just getting out of control. We would write a function that formatted a field in a very explicit way and paid attention to several very well-documented rules. But then that function existed, and a second person would need something exactly like it, and they wouldn't find it, or it'd be in another branch and in the code base. And so they'd be in a different branch that doesn't have it yet. It's not merged. So they create the exact same thing in a very slightly different way. And all of a sudden we have 3 or 4 functions that do the exact same thing. It's terrible. So this is really frustrating. Drupal is really good at expressing very complicated, very good content models. But then getting that data outside of the content model and making it readable just by humans, much less computers, is really hard. It feels a little bit like dying inside, right? Because all the hard work you put into building this very good content model is just gone. You don't have this organization. You don't have this really structured, wrapper around getting the data out of Drupal. And so we need a solution to this problem, right? This is something that lots of people deal with. I can imagine that if you guys write, Drupal code, at some point or another, you've had to parse out a Drupal entity and go and be okay, here's the entity object. I'm going to get this field. I'm going to get this language and this property within the field. I'm going to get the TID, right? And then you're oh wait, the TID doesn't actually contain the taxonomy term. Hold on, let me load the taxonomy term and actually do this whole processing thing and do the same thing on 3 fields on that taxonomy term, and then return an array of data, right? That happens quite a bit, right? And when you do that over and over, all of a sudden you have all this code that sort of intersects at some point, and you need to be able to organize that so you don't have to do all of this work over and over. That's where Distill comes in. So the project that I was talking about previously became a real problem, and we solved that problem by creating a module that lets us be really organized and take a very pragmatic approach to this problem. So we call that module Distill. What is it? Well, it is a Drupal module that enables dependent modules to extract and format data from entities in a really, really structured, organized way. You can find the module here, github.com, my username, and Distill. And it works in a very interesting way. It uses object-oriented PHP to basically organize its structure patterns and its processing patterns. It contains 2 classes. One is a processing class that defines field formatters. A processing class is just, think of it as a box, and the field formatters are functions within that box. And the field formatters are named according to 2 conventions. One by field type, so let's say you could say, okay, process image fields, right? File fields. All of them. If you pass this processor if you pass an entity into this processor, any field of type file will be run through that processor and will return data like that processor specifies. The second is a field formatter by type. By name. And so let's say that going back to our example on a file field, right? We have this processor that defines what should be returned from a file field. But then let's say for an explicit file field, we want to change the way that works, right? We want to have a small deviation, and we want to just not just return the file ID, but we want to return the path to the file, right? Let's say we want to do that. So we could create a processor class field formatter method that would override the way that processor worked for that explicit field name. And once you have a processor class, the distillation class takes an entity and a processor and a list of fields that it should return and get out of that entity, and then it just sort of gives you an array of consumable data. It's really actually pretty simple. I'll show you some code examples here in a bit. This is a visualization of how it works, right? So here we have this processor that has formatting functions, right? And these functions describe how fields of different types and different names should be processed. And here's an entity, and the distiller takes the entity, takes the processor, and gives you a bunch of consumable data. Breaking the formatters and the extractors into 2 different mechanisms, sort of like this, right? We have the processor and the formatter, is sort of the key concept here, right? it allows you to actually organize the processor methods and classes, right? You can actually create structured methods around formatting data. And then you can pass that into, you can pass any entity into the distiller in any processor and get data out of it, right? And it's very reusable, it's organized, and it's very extendable. So using object orientation allows you to define a processor class, but then you can create extensions of that class that deviate from what the parent processor class is defined, right? So let's say that you have, you're like, let's just say you have a processor class named parent, right? And that sets up how all the different field types should be processed for any entity in your site. Let's say that you had a content type called article, right? And you want to change the way that article's data is being formatted, right? You can create a subclass of that parent class and name it article. And you can change the way that specific fields are rendered, or change the way that a field type is rendered, anything you want to do. And you can do that as much as you want. It could be as organized or disorganized as you'd like. So it's kind of like this, right? Parent processing rule set. This is your main processor class, and then these are different deviations of the parent, right? Like think of this as like, this is the way that articles get formatted. This is the way that basic pages get formatted. This is the way that taxonomy terms get formatted, and this is the way that users get formatted, right? And then you pass all of those into the distiller, pass an entity into it, and you've got data. It's very consistent. So let's see how this works. I've got some code examples for you, and those are also available on GitHub. So if you want to follow along with me and sort of see what's going on, I'm going to leave this up here for a minute. It's just github.com, Patrico, Coffey, distill_example. Again, that's a really weird handle, I recognize, but it's pretty much always unique. So let's take a look. So I'm going to pull up, first off, here's the distill module. This is the repository for it. It has plenty of documentation around this, and it basically is a very condensed version of this talk, and it'll explain everything about this to you. And then here's the example module that sort of, that's what I'm going to be showing you. So let's take a look. I'm in the example module right now in my current working directory. And I'm going to show you how this works. So we're going to open the module file for this implementation of Distill, and we're going to see how this works. So here I have a menu hook that defines two menu callbacks, right? First, distill/bad, which is an example of data that is just not consumable by other systems, and just kind of hard to read and understand. And then I have a menu callback that is called distill, and that is an example of very well-distilled data, right? So let's take a look at the bad example first, just to get a clear idea of what we're dealing with, right? Here's our menu callback for this bad data stuff, right? And here we're going to load an entity, and then we're going to return the Drupal JSON output of that entity, right? And let's see what that looks like. It looks like this. It's kind of a mess. There's a lot of properties that we don't need. That if you're putting this in a MongoDB that's supposed to be read by some Angular app or something like that, right? We don't need any of this data. Or, we need this and the title, right? We don't need to know that the language is undefined. Or if we do, we should be able to get a specific language of this entity without having all the other languages. In the file, we don't necessarily need the MIME type. There may be any number of things that we do or don't need within this object in the system that we're exporting it to. And if we're defining a component-based template, and we want to pass in properties that are consumable by that template, this is just impossible. You don't want to have to parse this in a template. That just makes your template files really long and really complicated, and that's annoying. So all this is really cryptic. It's really big. It's too much data. If you keep sending this over the wire, let's say you create a reactive application with Drupal, right? And you have this Meteor application or something sitting on the other end, and it's taking data. You're passing all this JSON over the wire, and you don't need half of it. It's just a waste of packets. So let's go back. Here's the good example that contains distill and implements it. Here we go. Here's that menu callback. Now, just as we did before, we're going to load an entity, right? And we're going to also load a processor. Now, Distill comes with a processor that contains sensible defaults for extracting all of your data. If you have, texts, integers, fields, date fields, entity reference fields, author fields, that sort of thing, it will deal with that by default. You don't have to do anything. You can get consumable data without writing any processors. It's only when you need to deviate from those sensible defaults that you have to deal with, the processor stuff, which I'll show you in a minute. And after we've created the processor, we create an instance of a distiller class, right? And this is really easy. All we have to do is pass in the type of the entity that we're going to process, the entity itself, which we loaded up there, and the processor, which we instantiated right there. Then, after we've done that, we can ask this distiller for data. And the way we do that is we call setField. And this setField function takes 3 parameters. The first parameter is the property that you're trying to get from Drupal. Right? So in this case, it's the node ID. And let's pretend that we're going to consume this with MongoDB, right? And we need an ID for this. So we want to assign the value of this property to the key underscore ID. And the third parameter, which isn't shown in this example, is an array that you can use to pass context all the way down the chain into the processing function. So let's say that you had some special case that you wanted to render an image and you wanted to see what browser it was rendering in, or if it was mobile, or if it was desktop, right? You could pass in something right there, and it would go all the way down the chain into the processor. You could say if mobile, return this; if desktop, return this. For image sizes, let's say. I'll show you that in a second. So we're asking for these 3 fields: the node ID, the title, the body, and the field image, and we're assigning it to ID. We didn't include a second parameter here, so it's assigned to title, and we're assigning it to post and image. If we go down just a little bit here, you're going to see that we're going to grab the author field from this entity as well, right? And this is an entity reference field, which is a little bit more complicated to deal with when we're just vomiting out the whole thing into JSON, right? Because all we have is an ID. And we have to actually load the other entity, the actual user entity, to get properties from it. But the processor, the default processor for entity reference fields of any sort, allows you to pass in a key in that third context array parameter, right? So the key is include fields, and it allows you to essentially do the same thing that you're doing up here with setField and include fields from those referenced entities. So we'll just pull in those fields for you. Done. No big deal. Same thing for taxonomy terms, right? Field tags. Assign it to topic. Pass in and include fields key in this context array. Name and TID. That's what we want. That's what we get. And then, at the very end, Drupal JSON output, distiller, get field values. It just executes the processors that are proper, so that it knows, like, okay, this field has a type and it has a name. There's a processor for the field name, so we don't run the field type, run the field name processor. It does all those calculations, returns an array of data that you can consume. And we're going to return that in JSON format, and then we're going to exit. So let's see what it looks like. We're going to go to /distill. This is a much more consumable piece of data. We have an ID, a title, a post which has a value, and an image which is an actual link to the image where it exists on the canonical server. We have a user object that contains the name and the email address of the author. And we have a topic object that contains the name of each reference topic and the TID. So if we wanted to do another request to another endpoint, load the actual term and process that with the distiller, we could actually do that as well. This is much more consumable. You could take this, you could throw this into any application, and you could parse it out. This is actually, I kind of formatted this in a way that it would be consumable by MongoDB. If you were to just throw this into MongoDB or Redis, you'd be able to get it out immediately. So let's say that you wanted to write like a cache layer for some weird thing, for some weird proprietary like database or something that you're working on in an enterprise. This is golden. It lets you cache that data and get it back and keep track of everything in between. So this is really simple. This is really easy to do. We haven't even delved into the processor classes, right? We can change everything about this if we need to. Sensible defaults, very good. Actual image. This is a Pizza Monster article, so might as well have a Pizza Monster picture. So let's go back to the code here. So if we go down here, you'll see that I've created a class called distill entity test entity processor, and that extends StillProcessor, right? And this is essentially a subclass of StillProcessor. Now, in this class, I can create processing methods, and there's a specific format for that. The format is the word process, type, text with summary, and then type, or as you can see down here, process, name, and then field. And using these, naming conventions, you can process any field of any type or of any name. Also, any property. It doesn't just deal with fields. If you want to return like the NID, like I showed you, or the created date, that's not an actual field. You have to do some crazy stuff. You can actually get those values from the entity objects, just like you can fields, and process them. It doesn't. It covers the difference between fields and properties, right? So let's say that we want to use this class, right? What's it going to do? Well, it's going to process the field that's named body, and instead of returning the value of the field, it's going to return hi, I am a body field. And so if we go back up here to the place that we actually use distill, and this example page callback, and instead of using the default distill processor, we comment that out, and we actually use, I'm sorry, I can't type on this keyboard. We actually use the distill test entity processor that we defined down below. Let's see what happens. We're passing it into this distiller already, no big deal. So as you can see, it ran that processor on that explicit field. It didn't change the other text fields like title. If we had done the text processor and changed the value of that with another type formatter, it would have done that as well, but we had changed that explicit field. And we can make a subclass of this and change it again and do whatever we want. We can essentially, the person that's implementing this module is responsible for creating and architecting the structure of the classes to whatever meets their needs. But you can do pretty much anything you want, and there are sensible defaults, so if you want to create just a quick endpoint with Drupal for a headless Drupal site or something, you can use this. Create a menu hook, use distill, pass it in, you're done. This is something that is still something that I'm working on. It actually, as past coding standards, it's something that can go on D.O. I like GitHub because it lets me manage projects really easily. And when I work on open source stuff, I like to be as effective as I can, and GitHub is really easy for me. So it's on GitHub, but it's pretty much at a 1.0 version now, and so it's at a place where I'm comfortable saying that it's usable. So does anybody have questions?
So is your module like a plugin to the RESTful, or what is the difference between that module and just a RESTful?
So the RESTful module is a module that allows you to create CTools content types that generate structured endpoints for building an API.
Okay.
It also contains a tool on top of that sort of allows you to do this.
Yeah.
It lets you take an entity and return it with this API, and then it has a bunch of defaults, and you can sort of create overrides for that, but it's the same problem. You're creating inline PHP functions or a bunch of PHP functions that just have no organization pattern. So you run into the same problem. And I'm going to be working on trying to integrate this with RESTful, so you can sort of install RESTful, install distill, and have endpoints that return distill objects.
Okay.
This actually doesn't do any data serving. It just formats the data and lets you do whatever you want with it.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Okay. This might be off of I'm very new to Drupal.
Yeah, no worries.
I'm working on a project with a coworker who's a Drupal expert.
Mm-hmm.
And so he's built a custom entity, which is it got form field data that people have filled in.
Mm-hmm.
It's their application requests.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if using a combination of probably this tool with some other modules, whether I can put this in a regular database format. I've got a standard relational database
Mm-hmm.
where things are you know, it's just the data I'm interested in. It's
Mhm.
not all this Drupal stuff.
Right.
And one possible solution to having our legacy stuff keep working is to be able to keep these in sync.
Absolutely.
To take the entity data with its Drupalized, you know, its entities, and they're
Mhm.
hard to get at, and some kind of like, when someone enters a form, somehow have Drupal know, hey, a new entity of this type has been created.
Absolutely.
Trigger off a process to create the corresponding record in our traditional database.
Absolutely. This is something that this would serve you very well in. In fact, I'm going to show you a quick example of something that I did. I created a module called MongoSync, which implements the distill module, and it does exactly what you're talking about. So if you check this out, it has several hooks in it. And it says, okay, when there's a new entity, MongoSync entity insert, go ahead, do some stuff. It checks to see if MongoSync is enabled and all that stuff. It's a pretty good wrapper for MongoDB and Drupal. And it actually invokes all hooks for Mongo entity insert and this module, and then it processes it, and you're good to go. So what I did with this is I implemented this MongoSync hook. I said, okay, when Drupal has inserted an entity, and this MongoSync module is trying to insert that entity into another database.
Mm-hmm.
In this case, MongoDB, but in your case, some other relational database.
Right.
Go ahead and allow it to process this data and return it. And so what I did was I used distill to process the data, and at that point, I just returned an object of data, and it was really easy to insert into MongoDB, and it could be really easy to insert into your relational database as well.
Oh, okay. So is there there's a hook in the entity API which kicks us off?
Mm-hmm, exactly. It would be even simpler for you since you're not abstracting the concept of this. You would just say entity, hook entity presave or hook entity insert, and then from that you get the entire entity object, pass that into distill, throw it into your database.
Great.
Any other questions? No? Cool. Well, thank you very much for listening to me talk, and if you have any questions later on, feel free to tweet me or file an issue on GitHub. I'm always working on open source stuff, so thank you very much.